Mock 2S.
Alrighty, welcome back to another Tuesday where we look at the backlog. We finished our 7.0 work, so now everything we're looking at is for 8. Or never, right? Because sometimes we approve stuff that doesn't actually happen. That happens as well. Alright, so do we think we can talk about JSON, or I don't think we can, right? Nobody's from JSON here, right?
Yeah, and we talked about this one last week, and we concluded we couldn't talk about it without them.
Right, but nobody dialed in, right? No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Then let's skip this one here. As soon as I get Teams to... Yeah, that's very helpful. The overlay from Teams is very helpful. All right.
Yeah, I hate applications that don't give me a real title bar. I don't want my tabs up there.
Yeah, especially because Teams puts the presenter thingy there, which I can't remove for some reason. Yeah, you can click on it and nothing happens. That's great. All right, so anybody context on this one? Probably not either, right? For the same reason.
I mean, I can guess what it's for.
I mean,
which is
yeah.
They have this notion that the first time that you pass one of these options into serialize or deserialize, they lock it out from further changes, and they're just making it so that you can lock it out from further changes without serializing or deserializing something. Also, that now you can ask the question, apparently.
We don't really have this pattern in this way, right? I think in WPF, the closest we have is freezable collections, which I'm not sure I would consider a success.
I mean, this is why a lot of options types don't have setters, right, in the BCL, like for the properties. So they're always immutable.
Well, we have that pattern, and then we have the other one where basically whatever you pass it to just takes a snapshot.
Mm-hmm.
And then it doesn't matter when you mutate before or after. It just, once you pass it around, the other side has a copy.
Yeah, what makes this unique is that the options object, I believe, has a cache on it, which we very heavily rely on.
Right. So yeah, copying here is not an option. I think I mean, to me, immutability is really a weird way to put it.
Yeah, I feel like our normal, like we could call it is read only and make read only, or is frozen and freeze, but it doesn't feel like immutable is the right.
So, I mean, this might be a problem where the people who are more familiar with this aren't here, but like, if it's just a cache, could the setters for all the properties invalidate the cache?
No, because the way the system works is as soon as if you construct the options, you can mutate everything at will. And then as soon as you serialize something, the serializer marks the options type as now you can no longer modify it. Now, if you try to modify anything, it will not invalidate the cache. It will just throw an exception and tell you that you can't modify it anymore. So that once the cache is in use, basically it becomes read-only, which is why the cache now is reliable.
Yeah, I think it also has concurrency issues. Right now, I think it can be used concurrently.
I believe that's true. I think the cache is obviously
like the first read has to be special, or they do locking work on that one. But that as long as you let the first read happen, I think it goes into a read-only safe mode or a concurrent safe mode.
Yeah, I do like Jeremy's suggestion of is read-only and make read-only. Freeze, I've seen used a few times as well, but normally if you have something that's freezable, you can also thaw it. Mm-hmm. And we don't have the ability to do that here, so I wouldn't necessarily use that terminology.
Yeah, I think this is an example where we should probably talk to the person. So like the scenario in and of itself makes sense, but in the past we also haven't done that either, right? In the past what we have done is we have given people effectively a method that constructs the serializer options with the default that makes sense for the scenario, right? We have this, we have the web defaults and we have the regular defaults, for example, right? With the intent that you construct it and then you are able to modify it and tweak it to your behavior, but you basically inherit the defaults that the other side wanted to give you. So they're saying they have a core contract library, so they would want to expose their serializer options, but they're concerned that people can modify it afterwards. So I guess the question becomes, would a method make more sense here for them? In which case they don't need a new API. They can just create a method that creates the options that effectively have whatever defaults they want to use. And then the consumer can tweak things if they need to. And I think that generally speaking makes sense because, you may want to add, let's say, a particular resolver, or you want to add a particular converter that only makes sense in one scenario.
Well, I mean, I think there's two things. One is, in this library, these are options we use and you can tweak them, which would be give a non-locked, frozen, whatever version of this. And the other would be, this is our options type is public so that you can use the caches from our type, but you can't modify it. Where right now they would have to do the workaround of before it gets exposed as a public, they have to finish setting it up and then just call serialize on something and then not care what the result is. And I think they're saying we want the side effect, not the effect. So can you give us the method as a direct effect?
Yeah, I think I understand that. It just means that basically with their design, they would have a global read-only options that works as their cache, which, yes, if they're basically happy with one instance that carries all the state, then I guess that works.
But again, as you pointed out, that's what we do ourselves, right? Like we have a bunch of singletons floating around.
No, the web default, right? I thought that the web default and other default were factories, not singletons.
Yeah. And they are factories for the reason that we expect people to be able to add their own converters, right? Because the web defaults are really more about things like casing and I forgot there's a few other settings that we said, right? But the idea is that people want to add their own converters, right? So I guess in this case, it's really not that case, right? They just have effectively a set of libraries that all work as one unit, and they want to be able to say that they all share the same cache and they all have the same configuration, in which case they are probably happy with one singleton. They just happen to spread it over 4 assemblies and they use internal visible 2 today, but they could just make it public. Yeah, I mean, as a general design point, I think I buy it. We just have to, I guess, agree on what the pattern is. I would probably go with read-only as well. I mean, strictly speaking, you could get away with immutability because immutability means that not only can you not modify it, like the observable state won't change, which would also be the case here, right? Once you make it immutable, like things can no longer change, right? Whatever converters you have are the ones you have. Whatever configuration you have is the one that you have for eternity. Versus read-only just means that you can't change it, but it might change underneath you. But I think it's weird to have this notion that some things are mutable up to a point and then they become suddenly immutable. It's something we generally don't have. And we could say that it's an important distinction here. So we want people to know that the state never changes, in which case immutability is probably the better terminology. But
it looks like nowhere in the BCL have we ever added a property called isImmutable.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing we have of immutability really is the mutable collections, right? Which, as people pointed out, is really more persistent collections, but I think we ignored that at the time because nobody knew what that meant. We have is read only, but we don't have a corresponding one that would make it read only, right?
I know we have an as read only, but that's It's certainly not my favorite type in the BCL, but secure string has a make read only, as does a few other things. So make read only is a thing we have used. Looks like the dependency injection service collection also has a make read only.
I mean, I like it more than freeze, to be honest. Jesus Christ. I just look at Windows, the WPF's freezable. There's a lot of stuff on that. But yeah, I think so how would we feel then about like make read only and is read only? Is that?
I think that's better than immutable freeze stuff. So
Yeah, I mean, adding the Boolean of saying, are the setters all going to throw is already reasonable and consistent with, if you have a common reason for having exceptions, then making it easy to detect ahead of time is valuable. So that's the tester doer pattern. And then, because the scenario that they want, they can achieve right now with no API. I think that, but the fact that somebody thinks it is their scenario, that the API is reasonable. Because they could just like serialize nothing. In the usage example where they call options.lock, which apparently was what it was called before it was called ensure immutable.
Right.
So
but I think it's cleaner to just add the methods, or add the method in the property.
if this is a tester doer pattern, do we also need a like throw if read only helper method, or is that a step too far?
I mean, they might even have one internally. There's just no reason that you would make that external.
Well, I'm wondering, like, if you're checking to see if something is immutable, like, what's the thing that you're going to do if the answer is yes? Like, presumably you would fail. So should we provide an accelerator that just fails for you?
I don't think so. I don't think there's a clear scenario. I don't know that there's a clear scenario for somebody actually testing it, but like it could be if I get this thing and I'm allowed to modify it, and if I'm not, then make a copy of it and do the one tweak that I want and use that. Like, I don't think there's an obvious throw. Like, we don't have a throw accelerator on collections where they have is read only, which is just telling you, is the setter going to throw?
Fair enough.
So.
Yeah, I would start with I mean, to me, it is valuable to have an is read only just because for the scenario that Jeremy just pointed out, where you just want to know whether you can modify it or whether you need to make a copy of it. But I mean, we could really start with just this one method and see whether anybody complains, right? But I think it's just nice. Also, if you can see that something is reader only in the debugger.
Yep. Yeah, I think is read only and make read only are good. There's no clear read only.
So then I guess we're here with this. Yeah, it seems like the JSON guys are generally on board with it, so. Unless somebody objects, I think this is what we have.
Hey, look, we've proven that we can talk about a thing without the area owner present.
Things make sense, yes.
So I'm here
I
to
mean,
discuss.
we'll find out, right? Anyway.
So for Mikhail is late, so I'm here to discuss this one.
Okay.
So basically, system reflection metadata doesn't have a way to get the declaring type. And the current way of doing it is you get the event definition handle, then you search for accessors that are not null, and then the accessors, since they are methods, they can get the declaring type. But this proposal is basically we should be able to get the declaring type for properties and events and don't have to do this part of trying to get an accessor and try to figure out the declaring type using one of those. And yeah, I guess that's it.
And you have the ability to do that today, so you don't have to do anything expensive to get the declaring type handle?
You need to try to figure out the access and then get the declaring type from the accessor and not directly from the property or the event.
Oh, I
So
just saw
basically
the
you
comment.
can-
Yeah, you just do a binary search. Yes, that makes sense. So it's more like kind of like parity with the other definition types, right? The method definition, I guess, and field definition, right? Yeah. Yeah, makes total sense to me.
Those existing types, the definition types?
Yes, they are all in the metadata subnamespace though.
Do we not index that on source.net?
We do. You should see them. I just looked at it. Oh, source.net, I don't know actually. I just looked at an API catalog.
Okay, because the only type called property definition I see is in Microsoft Build Engine.
No, I mean, it's, I mean, source.net should index it because it's definitely in the runtime repo. I mean, it's an, I think it's technically an OOP that we ship in boxes as well.
I think source.net is currently broken. At least when I looked at it this morning, nothing from .NET runtime was indexed.
Yeah, then that is that. That's why I would miss. That's why I would be missing.
Fair enough. Okay, so basically this is, we already have one of these, and from them you can get down to the accessor. From the accessor you can pop back up to the declaring type.
Yes.
And this is just making it so that from here you can go to parent instead of going to child and then grandparent. Fair enough.
Are there other relationships that we should expose as part of this work item? For example, going from type to declaring module?
I mean,
Anybody ever want module?
I mean, the proposal here for get declaring type already exists on field definition and method definition. And we don't have, I think, anything for, I mean, I don't think anybody cares about modules or assemblies to begin with at that level.
That's fair. Yeah, I'm just looking through, I'm looking through the hierarchy right now and just seeing like anything that might be missing that we can just kind of green light as part of this.
Yeah, I mean, really the only thing I was going to look at is, I don't remember ever saying a thing called type definition handle, but maybe I'm just used to the other kind of reflection and just making sure that was right.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like all of these are the same things that I think of, except instead of being info, they're definition handles. So
Yeah, it's the beauty of metadata reader. Everything goes via handles. Yeah, if you know metadata, it's really just a fancy way to say token, because that's what they all are. They're just fancy ints. I think Brandon is on the call. I think I saw him earlier.
Yeah, I'm here. I mean, I'm not on the JSON team, so I won't be able to say like implementation wise if this is hard or not, but we did have a scenario where we wanted something like this, but because this doesn't exist, we basically have to allocate an extra array from a read-only sequence to write the raw value, which is why I'm proposing this. Basically, just save the allocation, because why not?
well, I mean, if you're just moving it from your code to their code, then
Well, that's true. Yes, if I think I've glanced at the code internally, and there's no reason it shouldn't work, but
I mean, you could always call write raw value of char or of span in a loop as an
No,
implementation
you
if you
can't.
wanted to. No?
no, that breaks.
'cause there's something like
Oh, because
I'm trying to remember if it
validation.
has its
Yes.
validation that it receives, that it won't change the state.
So the JSON team did, Christoph as a member of the JSON team did, say that this was ready for review. So I'm going to assume the JSON team agreed that this is a useful API.
So read-only sequence.
So what is the quick?
Can you guys explain the validation thing a little bit more? So how does that stop you from running into a loop? I see that the example skips it. But...
Well, so the write raw value, to my recollection, checks that you don't, write raw value 3 close square bracket to close off an array. Like you have to call int array. And so it's going to check to make sure that the value you give it is legal JSON and that it won't change its nesting level. So basically that what you're writing is one legal JSON value. So if you call write raw value with whatever's in the first span, that doesn't necessarily make that guarantee.
So are you saying that this validation happens no matter what you pass in for the second parameter?
Well, right. So if you call write raw value skip validation true, then I think that just blitz, and you could, like, it's just copy the one data into the other and assume and trust you that you didn't change the state.
Right.
So that one could be called in a loop using the spans produced from the sequence and not have a problem.
Oh,
Wait, so does that mean in our case, Brennan, where it looks like we are skipping validation based on the
Right.
highlighted code, that we could do that?
if that's what skip input validation does. From what I read, the skip input validation is mostly around escaping and things like that, not actually like validating the actual JSON object. But I could be wrong.
Yeah, I
that's-
guess I was just asking, is it doing anything more than blitting? Like, is it adding anything else that would stop the loop from working?
Because looking at UTF-8 JSON writer.write values.raw, if you skip input validation for some reason, it thinks it's a string, and then otherwise it'll load it into a JSON reader and keep calling read to drain it out. And if that didn't throw, meaning it didn't pop into a negative depth, then, and I don't know where it didn't check that it didn't leave it in a partial depth, but then it just says make my buffer big enough and copy the bytes.
Oh.
So it should be the case that if you pass true, or if you're passing true, that you don't need to make a buffer or do things, but there may be higher level code in play that I'm not looking at.
Yeah, I agree with Jeremy's take on that. I think if you pass true there, like you can literally write anything. We just pray that you don't write anything invalid because you'll corrupt the internal state if you do.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
and you can't. So it's possible today, if you pass skip validation true, to implement this as a loop around span of byte. If you have a read-only sequence of char, things become quite a bit harder.
Yeah. I mean, I think what it really boils down to, like, because I mean, I guess whatever logic they currently have, would you be able to basically rewire that logic with a read-only sequence, right? That would be probably non-trivial implementation work for JSON, right? If everybody just wants this to basically effectively skip validation true all the time, then I'd rather not have the API and tell people like, yep, just write the loop yourself.
My recollection of UTF-8 JSON reader when it's in sequence mode, it can't know if it's reached the end yet. So it has this weird notion of like, I might be not done, but if you give it a span, it knows you either gave me everything or we're broken. And so write raw value with a sequence that's validating means it does need to be of complete payload, but I don't know if that means that it needs this notion of I couldn't write it because I couldn't verify it, or if it would just throw in that case. And I think that would require whoever this year's ASON is to have an opinion.
Yeah, looking at the implementation, it should be actually pretty trivial to have it accept read-only sequence.
Yeah, it's just a policy question of what does it do if the sequence is incomplete? Because that's a state that the reader supports inherently, but maybe it's that the reader supports. And if we want to say the writer says, give me the write raw value, you obviously had to have been complete, so it's going to throw, then that'd be fine. It would just do the same thing as it's doing in the span case. It would keep draining it in a loop and then move on.
Well, the writer,
it will throw.
If it was incomplete, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the contract of the method is that it's a value, right? So it can't be like half a value.
Right.
But that would be true whether it's a span or a sequence, right? It just means that whatever argument you give it better be the complete value.
True. Yeah, I think I'm overthinking it, and it's if this can be proven to be a value, then it's fine, and if it can't, then it can't. And the only reason that the write raw value needs it is, or needs the span right now, is because Brendan, what's the scenario where you have a thing that you know is a single value that you have in a sequence?
It's a bit complicated, but basically we have a multi-server scenario where we pass some message from one server to the other, and that server then reads it from the pipe, and which gives you a read-only sequence, and then we want to write it to a client or something as a read-only sequence of JSON, because we know from the other server that it's going to be fully validated JSON.
Yeah, so Jeremy, if you recall, the reason this API was added in the first place way back when was so that you could envelope JSON messages. You have a message that you already know is JSON, and then you just like want to put some headers around it, for instance. But otherwise, the original message is its own object.
I mean, if I really recall correctly, the original reason that we added this is because Christoph didn't want to pay performance costs of running things through an encoder, and he wanted to say, I have some bytes, just write them down.
I recall that they were actually prepending data to it, but maybe I'm recalling correctly.
Yeah, I mean, doing an embedded, doing a nest also makes sense. I don't remember what this does if you're in an object and you need to write a property, but I guess you would have already called write property name, and now you just are in write property value. But
right, this this requires, I don't know if this requires you to be.
You need to write a thing that is legal for the state that you think that you're in.
Yes.
Yeah. Seems fair. I mean, I guess the reader already uses read-only sequence. I know we don't use it in a lot of places, but I don't see a reason why the writer can't train from it. The API it's using inherently supports it. So.
Yeah, that would be my other question. Like, how much of JSON knows about sequences today?
The JSON reader understands sequences natively.
Yeah, I think UTF-8 JSON reader is the one and only thing in the BCL that understands sequence. So making the writer support it for the purposes of passing it to the reader seems reasonable.
Also, because of pipelines and ASP.NET Land, these things exist a lot more, and we use JSON a lot. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't have any concerns. It just seems weird that for RAWs we have support for sequences, but for nothing else. I guess for all the other ones, I guess it doesn't make sense because by definition they are small payloads, right?
Yeah, we're particularly interested in read-only sequence of byte, right? Because that's what pipelines gives us. But car is the other common one, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. So maybe.
Well, to Levi's point, or actually no, JSON serialization is based on UTF-16, right?
No, it serializes to a UTF-8 buffer.
No, but the \U, that's UTF-16.
That's UTF-16, correct.
So the transcoder doesn't itself care about surrogate pairs.
Well, the transcoder, if you are validating the JSON, the validation process will validate that you have put correct surrogate pairs into your string. But if you say skip validation, we're literally just going to write them out on the wire as is, whatever you give us.
But so I'm just thinking through whether or not the char implementation is even possible without doing extra buffering right now. And
it would be complicated.
Because it would need to, for every span it sees, create at least a temporary place that it has the UTF-8 version, because it'll need to transcode everything into UTF-8. Oh, that's actually the problem, because you can't transcode a high surrogate to UTF-8. You need the low surrogate to go with it, right?
Correct. You basically need to have a temporary buffer, which you can do all of that allocation free. It just becomes a little bit mind-numbing. But yeah, we actually have helpers in the framework to do all of this for you, so that you can start with, say, a read-only sequence of char, and then turn it into a series of array segments or what have you. Those helpers generally will allocate. But if the scenario is that you're writing lots of data, then maybe a single allocation to hold a temporary buffer is not a bad thing. And you could also optimize it to say, if the sequence is a single buffer sequence, just one shot it and call it a day.
Yeah, so for comparison, the JSON document type, we support parsing a read-only memory of byte, a read-only memory of char, and a read-only sequence of byte. We do not support read-only sequence of char. So I think JSON,
that would get more complicated.
I think the JSON system text JSON universe does not support sequence of char. So I don't think we should add that overload.
Yeah, like I said, byte is the one we really want.
It just creates too many. It's boundary problems and off by one errors that until we have a real scenario for it, I think we should just hold it back.
Sorry, I missed the conclusion. You're saying we are holding it back now because there's some.
Sorry, the write raw value of read-only sequence of byte is consistent with this namespace.
Okay.
The read-only sequence of char is inconsistent with the namespace. We should not add it.
Ah.
Nothing in system text JSON supports sequence of char.
Yeah, in the future, you could read-only sequence of char and lighten the JSON stack, but it would be there are some edge cases that you would definitely want to be careful about handling.
I mean, there are methods that take read-only span of char though on the writer, right?
But it's self-contained. That's the
Right.
point. That's the thing.
Yeah. So that's why I said with JSON document we took memory instead of span of both byte and char, but when it came to sequences, we only took bytes. We didn't accept sequence of char.
I see what you're saying.
Again, I think we only need the byte thing. But as far as the self-containedness of this, right? Like if you don't skip validation, are you assuming that this is self-contained? I mean, you are, right?
But it's the problem
yes.
is the logic that has to turn the UTF-8 or UTF-16 data into UTF-8 data. If you have I'll just say the first span out of the sequence ends in a high surrogate or low surrogate, whichever one comes first. That now needs to be complicatedly buffered and shoved into the next state, which makes the transcoding not the one shot that I think it's already implemented as. And I don't like it's more work for a thing no one wants to do.
I got it. So since you're
to a place that doesn't
transcoding,
have state.
you don't want to. Yeah. Okay. So since you're transcoding, you don't want to have to like deal with the multi-surrogate characters.
Right.
Okay.
A UTF-16 JSON writer would do this no problem because you would get a high surrogate or low surrogate or whichever one's first, and you just turn that into /u, that exact same 16-bit value, and you move on with life. But with UTF-16 to UTF-8, you need the paired surrogate to know what to turn it into.
I got it. So doable, but hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, you would be adding state to a mechanism that very intentionally tries to avoid state. Right?
So that's why my recommendation is to hold it back until we have a scenario asking for it.
So is that the fair summary then?
Yep.
That works. All right, so anybody context on this?
Steve's on the line, right?
Steve knows everything about sockets.
Sorry, I'm looking.
We should do this though.
Yeah. So the context, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So the context is when we did the whole port from .NET Framework to .NET Core in the early days, we ended up with this split of systemnet across multiple assemblies. And we ended up with this, because of the constructors that are on socket, we have this weird internal socket exception derived type that exists purely to be able to provide additional information in the socket exception message, because the base socket exception class doesn't allow you to provide a message. So basically this is just saying let's allow you to provide a message.
I can attest. I could attest to this potentially being useful. Like Kestrel will construct its own socket exception sometimes because it gets error codes first. Now we just accept the default messages. So, but like people sometimes complain that they're like not the most readable.
Yeah, and didn't we actually just add a similar overload to web socket exception? The constructor. Maybe I'm misremembering, but I swear like we did something very, very similar to this on another type recently. So there's established precedent.
Do we, while we're editing this exception, should we also add internal exception overloads, or should we just leave it where it assumes that it's for some reason never inheriting an exception state?
I don't know if I've seen
I
it.
mean, we don't have any use for it because in our own uses, we basically get an error code from the OS and then construct the exception. So we don't already have another exception sitting around to use as inner. But I don't have an objection to it if you think someone somewhere might.
I mean,
I
it is the
say
path.
you ain't gonna need it. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really care. It's simply if we moved from all that you need is a number to maybe you care about the message. It's do you maybe care about inner exception? Because it seems like this was basically the class is public so you can catch it. We don't intend anyone to ever instantiate it, but now we keep coming up with scenarios where they're instantiating it across an assembly boundary. So
I mean, to be clear, we've always needed to provide a message. We've just done it in a very roundabout way.
okay.
We've never needed to provide an inner exception.
Okay.
And like you say that you should catch it and not throw it, but there are APIs that just expose like socket error codes, and then you might choose to selectively throw, like Kestrel does. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have an opinion of whether or not we add it. I'm just adding the question or asking the question to the room to see if anybody cares one way or the other. So it sounds like no one cares. So
Yeah, that was my takeaway.
Uniformity be damned.
well, consistency with the existing type. But yes, if we were adding a new exception, we'd ask why it wasn't taking it.
Right. More JSON stuff. Looks like somebody wants to expose a value on JSON encoded value.
They want to get
this is the original one.
the system string back out.
I think so, yeah. I mean, it makes sense to me. I mean, I don't know why we didn't expose it in the first place.
Because we would have to keep it.
So
Actually, I guess we wouldn't have to keep it around. We could always cache it on demand.
I mean, I think it would probably make sense just to keep it because caching it on demand, like you're just doing redundant work. It does double the size of the, almost double the size of the type, but who cares?
Yeah, I guess it depends on your entry point, right? If your entry point is a string, then it's easy. If the entry point is a byte or a char, then you have to create it anyways.
Fair enough. So that one, yes. If it came from a string, I think you would hold the reference. If it came from something else, I think you would be lazy.
Yeah. Which I think is kind of what he's proposing here, is except that you may not get it at all, right?
Yeah, I mean, that is weird what he has there, because it looks like he's saying if you
didn't start with a string, you just
came
get an
from
empty
the null string, that the null string serializes as the empty string, and so we give you back the empty string. But I don't know. Ignoring what he actually wrote for the implementation, it seems reasonable.
Yeah. So then we should probably call this out though, and say that our assumption is that you would always get back a string representation, and worst case it's being produced out of thin air.
I mean, this type isn't lazy, is it? Isn't it always just produce both? I'm looking at it. I don't know.
Well, the way I understand the type, just looking at the APIs, is there's an encode method that takes a string, there's one that takes a span of byte, and then there's one that takes a span of char. So I would assume if you start with the one that takes the string, you would just store the one you were given. But if you start with the with a span, then it becomes the question of like, do you at the time you encode you produce the string, or are you doing it at the time somebody actually asks for the string? Because presumably most of the time nobody will ask for the string. Because the only thing people care about is the encoded bytes.
The name of this type is not JSON encoded value, it's JSON encoded text.
Also,
There is no
point.
type called JSON encoded value.
Yes, for some reason I didn't even see that.
As a note, like the toString implementation is exactly equivalent to what they're proposing this value to be in the current type.
Well, yep, fair enough. ToString is, you know, everyone's favorite method to hate.
So are we okay with what I wrote here?
Yeah, I think what they're doing, or what they had is the suggestion, looking at the implementation. ToString does exactly what they said here. It returns value or the empty string, and I think it's because this is a struct, and we wanted the default structs ToString to, I guess, not produce null.
Right.
And I guess they're saying the same thing here of we wouldn't have accepted null as an input, therefore we're not going to give you back null as an output. If you create the default one that represents the empty string.
Ah, I see. So the null case would only be when you just have a default struct, I guess. Yes.
Yeah, because if you give it the null string, they throw an exception. And
yeah,
if
I mean,
you give it a span, then it treats it as empty. So.
Yeah, if the intent here is value would have been initialized from encode, regardless of what you give it, a span or a string, then that makes sense. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, then I think we can live with that.
Yeah, as long as we don't, I'm just looking through some stuff. We should just be careful that we don't give the impression that it returns the same string instance that you passed in. I mean,
What?
but that's just a doc thing.
Why would that matter, frankly?
Because the string can be, the value can change, I believe. Oh, never mind. No, the value won't change. Some people like caching, instances of things as an optimization rather than doing value equality. It's weird. But again, that's a doc issue. I wouldn't worry too much about it.
I agree, but we do that all the time. Like that's a real scenario. Like usually we path it, right? Like we'll be like, is this actually the reference we think it might be? And then if not, we'll do the full comparison.
Yeah, but doesn't string equals do that already?
I mean, I would assume it would yeah, fast
That it
out
starts
and-
off with the, am I literally the same string? Oh, okay. Like,
Yeah,
done.
that might be some code we should delete in some places.
Yeah, it's,
I guess the point is that like we do try to use the same reference to get that fast path. But yeah, that code that I'm talking about where we literally check the fast path, that might not exist.
Yeah, I guess my question was the
Reasons-
inverse. Like, if I give you a string, why would you not just hold on to that? Like, what would be a scenario that we would store a different instance than from the one given?
it's what they do. I don't know why.
It is what they do.
They turn the string into the span, call the span when the span one allocates a new string.
Okay, that seems unfortunate.
Whatever.
Yeah.
The entire point of this is that it's done once, so if they end up spending an extra 5 nanoseconds doing a conversion, whatever.
I see. Yeah, okay.
I think it's just so it gives them, one implementation instead of two.
Yeah, I guess that's fair, but yeah, whatever.
Also
Yep.
because the input I think eventually ends up as a char instead of a string, or a span instead of a string. So like Jeremy said, one implementation.
Yeah, toString. This is a case where I probably documented that that's what toString gives back, but the general guidance we have on toString is for debugging purposes, except for the few places that say that it's not. And having a property makes it much clearer that it is a thing that you're allowed to depend on programmatically. So,
yeah. One other thing that would be a bit interesting is that JSON encoded text does actually have a concept of equality. You can compare two JSON encoded text instances for equality. And that could return a different result than comparing the two values for equality. So if you have JSON encoded text A and JSON encoded text B, and you ask, are these two things equal to one another, you'll get true or false back. If you say, is A.value equal to B.value, you could get a different true or false response back. And
so
the reason
they're not the same reference. Oh, sorry.
No, it's because JSON encoded text differentiates default of T versus empty string internally.
So you're saying the empty
It's
string
just
and the
that one
null string
case.
is considered
Yes.
equal by string equals, but it's not considered equal by JSON encoded text?
Correct. Default of JSON encoded text does not equal JSON encoded text dot create from empty string, according to JSON encoded text zone equality compare or equality compare.
Yeah. Default is only equal to default.
Yes. So now we would say that we are exposing a property value which is ostensibly the same as the underlying JSON encoded text, but the equality semantics here are ever so slightly different than the equality semantics of the container. Again, maybe that's okay. Maybe that's a doc thing.
Yeah. Why do you have a default JSON encoded text, and why do you care?
Because it's a struct, and structs can be defaulted.
Right, but why do you have it? The fact that you have one was your bug.
I agree this is kind of a nuanced edge case, but like they could make it the same probably, right? Without breaking anyone. Just use null instead of array.empty or whatever for their
It probably breaks someone somewhere, but
probably. I mean, if there's a way to take a dependency on it, someone will, right?
Yeah. I mean, the question at that point is like, what's worse, right? The disease or the cure? But
it's entirely possible that they want default to write down as null, which means that this value should actually be nullable of string. So I guess really that's the question of what does JSON writer do with the default JSON encoded text?
It treats it as empty.
It treats it as the empty string?
Yes.
Oh, because it'll just look at the read-only memory and see that it's empty. It doesn't actually get to see the underlying array is null.
Correct.
Fair enough. Then yeah, maybe that was a autogen equality. Because if it's coercing null or default to the empty string, then I can go either way on what they do with their equals method.
Yeah. All right. So then this one here, does anybody context on this?
Sort of. So in versions ago, because time has no meaning, for the server options, which they showed here at the top, we added a type called SSL stream certificate context, which basically pre-builds the chain once, and every time it comes up again, you get to just pass the same chain instead of having to pass it, or instead of computing it every time that you have a new session. And this is extending it to the client side, so that if you're doing mutual authentication, you can have built your chain once and just say, keep using this chain every time you talk. The problem is, if this is the only API they've added, the SSL stream certificate context class has assumptions that it is only being used in the server role, which means they need to add a new thing that says that you're building it for a client context. And without that, we shouldn't add this member.
So you're saying SSL stream certificate context itself needs to be rethought with a client-centric view?
Right. So when it was originally proposed, it had like create for server and create for client, and then they said they weren't wiring up the client, and then they got rid of create for client, and then create for server just got called create. But there are things like the OCSP server stapling that when you create one of these things, it starts up a stapling context, and I don't know if that's valid for client certs, then maybe it's good and reasonable, but someone would need to be here from networking to say that they no longer believe that they would need to distinguish client and server contexts, which they originally thought they would have to. If I recall correctly. But otherwise, it's a very reasonable approach.
Then I guess we can just do this. Add the question here, and then just mark this as API needs work, and then somebody can take a look and flip it back.
Well, if the question has a satisfactory answer, would we just approve it as is, like over email or something, so that people can get started on it right away?
I mean, if it's a property, probably.
I mean, it's a property. So the top one exists.
Oh, the
It's
top
already
one
there.
already exists?
Server exists. What they wanted to do was add it to client.
Yeah.
I think that works, right?
Yep.
All right, so then, yeah, anybody has anything here that they want to talk about? If I just remove future for a second, it becomes a bit more manageable. Can just open those here and see where this leads us.
I mean, there's an obsolete one at the bottom that we could decide we wanted to take in 7RC, because obsolete is always better the sooner you do it, I guess. So since I just jumped the line.
Thanks, Jeremy.
So on the RSA class in .NET Framework 1.0, according to Emo's metadata, we had this public virtual byte array encrypt value and decrypt value that take a ever so wonderfully named parameter called RGB. And it has literally never worked because the one notation we had, RSA crypto service provider, it just threw out of this method saying it wasn't supported. And in 4.6 in framework, we changed it from abstract to virtual on the base class, throwing, saying it's not supported. But at that time, we hadn't yet invented the differentiated obsolete. And when we did, we just forgot to come back and mark this one as obsolete. So these are methods that never had defined behavior and have never been implemented in inbox cryptography. And so we're just painting them obsolete because they are.
I'm fine with this if you can tell me what RGB stands for here. Is that like someone copied the signature from something to do with colors? And then
Range of bytes.
Of course.
It's
Oh my
Hungarian. Yes, because this is .NET Framework 1.0 cryptography, where it was Windows devs who moved over to help set things up. So range of bytes.
I would have never guessed it in 100 years.
Yeah, I always interpreted it as randomly generated bytes because that's the scenario for this. You pass in a random value into it.
No, well, the one place that ever called this, it assumed that this was the RSA primitive operations.
Oh, great. So it's not even hybrid.
Yeah. This is that you gave it an exactly a pre-padded block, and that it just needs to do the key transform. See, like,
Right.
the other person who works in this area didn't know what it stood for. So, yeah, this was just bytes, but they didn't, like, the docs don't describe what the method was ever supposed to have done. I think the docs actually say don't call this, but now it'll say it in a compiler warning too.
So is there any derivative that actually is meaningful, or is the entire method like effectively dead?
In .NET Framework and .NET Core, there has never been a type that implemented this method via something other than throw not supported exception.
So then should we just hide the method then as well? Because it doesn't seem like this thing is doing anybody any favors, right?
That sounds great. Yeah, we can totally EB never it.
Well, this is certainly an extreme, and we should absolutely, obsolete, hide it, and maybe even this will be the first candidate for actually, removing a method. In general, though, like, should we be thinking about putting editor browsable never on things that we've obsoleted?
I mean, the problem is that it's kind of depending on what we think the likelihood of somebody suppressing it is, right? So, like, in a perfect world, like, if you suppress a particular obsolescence, then I think you want to see it in IntelliSense because you want to keep using it, right? Otherwise, otherwise you can't even discover that it's there, right? If that makes sense.
I guess it depends on why we obsoleted it.
Yeah, so I mean, that's what I'm saying. If the method group never works anywhere, like, there really is no point in writing code that calls it, right? At that point, it's just a fancy way to throw an exception. If there are cases like, oh, we don't want you to use it, but you keep using it because the alternative is not a drop-in replacement, then what are you going to do, right?
Yeah, this is why, a while back, remember when Jared brought his his proposal for, kind of having some weird binary /source compatibility while still being able to, like, rip methods out. I forget exactly what he called it, but that appeals to me because it fulfills the scenario that Steve was just talking about, where you don't want things, if you have a bunch of overloads of a method, right, and you have 5 vestigial overloads and one thing that you really want to direct people toward, like, we can kind of make those 5 vestigial methods not show up so that when you do, type.foo, you only see one thing in IntelliSense, and it's the pure path going forward. ED never is one way to do that, but I would very much like to see us maybe prioritize what Jared had mentioned a few months back.
And then I guess we are okay with not a diagnostic ID because we really don't think anybody would ever want to suppress that. Like, that seems pointless.
Fair enough. I was assuming implicitly that it was whatever the next ID is, but I'm happy with just generic obsolete.
Yeah, you can always pragma suppress directly around the call site if you care.
Yeah, I just really have a hard time seeing somebody first having hundreds of them, and then secondly, like, wanting to suppress it because all your call paths are blowing up right now, and always have, right? So it seems weird.
Yeah, and so this, when Steve mentioned remove it, when we started over in .NET Core, this method was cut, but when we unified the types again in Core 2 or 3 or whenever we did that, that's when we brought it back.
Yeah.
This
Talk
would
about
also
mistakes
be-
living a long time.
Well, this would also be, yet another thing we could throw on the heat for, releasing a new patch of net standard that brings forward a lot of the obsolescence that we've been doing to .NET Core. Because if this method exists in net standard 2.0, which it does, but the method never worked on .NET Core, like, how do people know if they're building a net standard library that they shouldn't be calling it?
Yeah. That's the unfortunate side effect of obsolescence being part of the API's contract, but yeah.
Well, it's not just obsolescence, right? Like Jeremy, didn't you say this method simply always throws an exception on .NET Core?
Well, not just core, presumably
The method is
everybody.
virtual. Derived types can do whatever they want. We have never shipped an implementation that did anything other than throw.
Sure. So in practice, that means it's going to throw.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's
But on .NET Framework, not just .NET Core, everywhere.
Yeah. That's
Everywhere.
Yeah.
There has never been a type that was produced by this team that has implemented this method.
okay. Fair.
And when Claire made RSA key vault, I don't think she made these methods work either. So
right.
Alrighty then. That was easy.
I assume Tomas showed up and wants you to pop back to the SSL stream issue.
I just put a comment on an issue, so I don't think the context was necessarily server specific. We made it so a little bit with the OCSP, which I think it's primarily helps for the server scenarios, but it's basically the goal is we don't have a way how to pass chain certificates on a client side. I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah, so my recollection for the server context, I didn't look at what we're actually doing. Sorry, in the certificate context, I didn't look at implementation to see what we're doing. I thought we used to check that it was even valid for the server role. Like when it built the chain, it checked.
No, we don't. No, we basically take the certificate and build a chain, and if you provide extra certificates, we build a chain with them and we send them. So you don't have to put them into the certificate stores.
Okay, and yeah, so then the other question, since I added OCSP stapling on the certificate context, was does it make sense for that to be done in the client role? And if not, do we need another method?
Yeah, that one
create for client or whatever.
Yeah, that one I'm not sure.
I mean, we could also say that it's low enough overhead that we don't care, but
yeah, that's one. Or we can look at a certificate and basically look if there is a purpose, right? And do it conditionally based on the certificate itself, possibly. So I don't know if we have to add another method at this point. I think we can get by, and if we figure out we really can't, we can revisit it. But I think it should be okay for now, and we can use the OCSP.
Okay, if you believe that the type was doesn't have anything in it that's server specific aside from the stapling support on Linux, then that's fine. I thought that it rejected non-server certificates out of the create method.
No, I think we might talk about it back in a day, but we didn't do it. So
okay. All right, then that removes my hesitation. So I guess we can
Excellent.
paint it green. Thank you, Tomasz.
Did we just spend 2 minutes to just say yes? Or no, I guess was the... Good. That's awesome. So this one, I think I just filed it based on the discussion we had. I don't think I actually know at all what's going on here.
Can I give my hot take?
Yes, please.
Like HTTP client's a bit of failure, right? We know this, right? With the HTTP client factory and all of that. And as much as Service Point was awful, like I had to use it. Like, at least if you didn't know much about HTTP, which is probably like most .NET devs, like you're not like accidentally creating a new connection for requests. Like I like HTTP client honestly because like I know how it works, right? And like I can like have control, but I think it's a pit of failure.
But it's the pit of failure that we know and love.
Like I said, I like it, but it's because we know and love it. Like I don't think that applies to the general public. And like Service Point Manager, it was solving a problem. like inelegantly, but
in a way that
it
even
was.
fewer people understood.
Yeah, but like I mean, it's trade-offs, right? Like it helped in certain scenarios. I mean, it ended up meaning you're sharing connections with like other random parts of your app, which had its own problems in sharing pools. But like,
So are you saying
like
you're not in favor of obsoleting it, or you're saying we should have a feature that replaces it?
I think we should think about it. Like I said, like it's been a while since I've used Service Point Manager, and I remember hating it a lot. So maybe it should be obsoleted, but like I'm not sure like HTTP Client Factory is the end game for like the HTTP client APIs in .NET. Like I do think the concept of like a static connection pool is actually useful, and if you look at like other languages like Node.js and Go, like I would have to look, but I'm pretty sure Node.js, right? Like, yeah, you're just like sharing a connection pool. I again, like I haven't looked super deeply into other platforms, but like I was just watching Nick Chapez, right? Like he's a YouTuber. Maybe some of you watching this stream right now, the other day did a thing about like you're using HTTP client wrong, right? And like all the top comments are like, this is, they literally call out us, like they call out the .NET API like designers and say like, this is just terrible design. Like how am I expected to know this? Like that I can't dispose the HTTP client. And like I was reading these comments and tempted to get defensive because like I like HTTP client and I'm on the API review board now, so I won't take credit for HTTP client. But still, like it was hard to disagree with them. Like if you don't know how it works, it is a pit of failure, and like so many people run into it. I see it a lot, right? Because we end up like getting, you know, ASP.NET customers complaining that their apps are falling over.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, I don't think anybody who's on this call right now was part of reviewing HTTP client when it got built. So
No. I mean, I worked with the people afterwards when we did it for 8 again, but I think I mean, it's still one of the better APIs we have, I think, for networking. It's a fairly intuitive API for the most scenarios. So
there are things I like about it. Yeah. And like once you know it, it is fine. But it's like it's a lot of people don't know about disposing the client, disposing the handler, and the connection pool.
yeah, I mean, just keep in mind what the previous versions were, right? If you look at web requests and you look at all of that bullshit, that was a lot harder to use because it didn't map to anything, right? It was just all, you know, concepts that we created out of thin air. But HTTP client at least talks about in terms of what the protocol does, right? Which helps a lot of people.
well, and the previous one also was like FTP and HTTP are the same thing.
Right.
Just don't have opinions. So yeah, my concern with obsoleting the whole class, there are 2 consts on it that I don't know that anybody actually cares about. But in their alternative proposal, they've listed that there are three members that actually they wouldn't mark obsolete.
Right.
And if that's the case, then obsoleting the type seems overreaching.
No, I think we discussed that, and that was basically the...
Oh, they just haven't updated the top to say that they would no longer keep those methods?
I want to say we discussed it last time, and I think the reason was it just didn't show up for them to obsolete, but like they had no objections, or they felt like obsoleting the whole thing makes more sense. I think that was where we landed. Like, I mean, they all have the same diagnostic ID, right? So like it doesn't really matter, I think, because you would just say, you know, if you don't like, if you mark all the members as obsoleted and put the diagnostic ID on it, then that's logically equivalent to putting the same ID on the whole type, right? It just means that all the methods that currently act as pass-throughs are effectively, you know, now also triggering because you accept the type, right? But that's fairly rare.
Yeah, this type only has static members on it, so I don't think anybody would have accepted it as a thing. But again, it's just in the proposal, they say there are some already obsolete things they actually want to mark as obsolete, and then 3 other things that aren't obsolete.
Right.
Which means that the type is not obsolete. It has 3 things on it.
I think we passed them to the HTTP web request, which is not obsolete. So I don't know if it'd be weird if you have API, which is not obsolete, which requires you to pass in obsolete members, like the service security protocol.
I mean, it is a little bit weird, but if it's just our implementation that has to absorb that, that's fine, right? It's more like, is this something that the user has to do, right? If the answer is no, then that seems fine, right? Because our concepts clearly interplay, right? And if we make one concept obsolete, but we still need to keep it working, then, well, we probably have to suppress some warning somewhere in the system.
If it's just HTTP web request, isn't that already obsolete with the same diagnostic ID?
No, I think you said HTTP client, right? What did you mean? HTTP web
No,
request?
the web request. I don't know if it's obsolete. I don't.
Because the obsolation number is the web request diagnostic ID. It's saying web request and all of its friends are obsolete. Stop calling them.
Yeah, that's what I thought we did already.
Because yeah, if they're not used by HTTP client or anything else that's, modern, then
We don't
sure,
care,
go ahead and mark
essentially.
them obsolete. But if it's that this is a thing that you need to use when working with an already obsoleted component, then
So we haven't marked the type, but we have made the factory methods obsolete, and the message says web request, HTTP web request, service point, and web client are obsolete.
right, it had no public constructor. You would have had to go through the
Use
web request
HTTP
to
client
create.
instead. So I think that would be the same thing. We already say that service point itself is obsolete, so I guess now we just would extend it to service point manager. Which, I mean, given that we are so far out, I mean, we could just start with marking the type and then see whether that doesn't work, right? Like I would say, it's very weird to obsolete 90% of members on a type. And then just say, oh, the type is too far.
Well, again, to me, it's whether or not there's a legitimate reason that they would not mark those last three. If a reasonable application would need to work with it to work with a type that's not already marked as obsolete, then they shouldn't have to suppress the warning of this was the place that you have to interact with it.
I guess that's true.
I just did quick search, and for example, the security protocol, we surface it in a few places in SSL stream.
Yeah, well, it's less about where we use it, right? It's more like, do you accept, like, is there legitimate scenarios where user code would say service point manager dot any of these three things? If the answer is no, then obsoleting the whole type is fine. If they are, then it's probably bad, because when you tell people do the thing, and when they do the thing, then it's like, oh, that's obsolete, right? Well, yeah, in general, yes, but this particular member is fine, right? At which point we should probably do what the original proposal was, which is not obsoleting the type, just obsoleting the remaining members and then leaving these three alone. So it really comes down to, what is the obsolescence for these three members? Undecided, or no, for sure they're not obsolete.
So why don't we do this? Since you are not sure, right, and we don't have enough information, I'll take it back to the team. And why don't we just come back to it next week?
Yeah, that works.
Or if you guys are okay with obsoleting, or if it's okay, go either way, we can do more research, and if feasible, and we meet the conditions that those are not used in reasonable APIs, we can obsolete the whole class, and if not, then they'll go with the plan B and we obsolete the members as proposed.
Yeah, I mean, I will point out the type. There are two members that they're not talking about on the type, which are both consts, but I don't think there's any reason anyone would use those consts outside of the type. And
yeah, I think they're just the default values for the other properties, right? So
yeah, because it's their default persistent connection limit and default non-persistent connection limit.
Yep.
And those don't look like they map any of the properties that are there, so I don't know why anyone would care about them. But if there's a legitimate reason that people would want those values, then again, we shouldn't mark the whole type, because the type is you can paint the type and then you can't unpaint the members. And oh, actually they do. They mark the const in the things they would mark as obsolete. They're the top 2 items. So yeah, I'm okay. If there are no legitimate uses for the last 3 members that are called remaining here, then marking the type is fine because it's 100% of the members. But if those 3 should not be obsolete, then we should not mark the type.
Alright, let me push this back to needs work so we know we discussed it. Alright. Anybody context on this?
Adding a non-generic one that returns object. But has it? Oh, it took a type parameter. They just want an overload that drops an optional parameter so they can call using not the named syntax.
No, I think the gist is here in the middle here basically. So it sounds like what's happening is because we added an overload here that takes the JSON type, if you now pass in null, it's ambiguous. So that's basically, in the past you could just say this one here if you wanted to pass in a cancellation token. But now null means, well, which one did you mean? Did you mean this one or did you mean the other one? And so now you have to either do the casting. So I think he's proposing having an overload that you don't have to pass in anything. You just can directly pass in cancellation token. As the
Okay,
tiebreaker.
so this is... I see.
But let me take a look at the actual methods.
So because null is valid, there's ambiguity in the 4th parameter, or
yeah,
2nd parameter, or wherever we are.
This is a general example where if you overload on a reference parameter, or if you add another one, then null can result in ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
These are the ones that do my head in with, like, are we making a source breaking change? Like when we were just adding overloads. That aren't like the trivial example of just attacking parameters on the end or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, varying the parameter. The only real issue is when null is a legal value, and then it becomes ambiguous what null means. We've said we don't care if somebody passes the word default, like if they use default instead of default of a type. That's sorry, you lose. Even though that can also be ambiguous. The other case that could get ambiguous is if you have type A, which is implicitly both B and C, and there are overloads that take a B and a C, but not an A. If you pass an instance of A, then it doesn't know which way you wanted to convert it. That's usually pain that we suffer ourselves because we added implicit conversion operators.
Yeah, you see that, what Jeremy just mentioned, you see that a few times with link extension methods. If you are IEnumerical of A and IEnumerical of B, it's like, you called select, I don't know what to do.
Yeah,
right. And then with the source breaking changes, like this isn't an example of that because like the generic parameter always has to be specified, but like that can add to like some questions too. If you have like generic and non-generic overloads and the generic can be inferred, and once you start adding overloads to that.
Well, adding overloads that when you recompile changes the behavior is not source breaking. Source breaking, you're saying if it's the same behavior if you use the non-generic or generic overload? Well, source breaking change is that when you upgrade, you can't compile anymore. Right. Yeah, that's what I mean. A thing that matches without doing generic inference has a higher preference, and so it wouldn't introduce an ambiguity. An exact call without doing generic inference beats an exact call with generic inference, which beats a object cast call, if I recall the order correctly. There's an order. You can do it safely. I'm not actually saying it is ambiguous. It's just another thing to consider. But you're right. It's a fairly easy rule. Yeah. So implicit conversions and interface diamond or interface parallel tracks are the only things that really make things ambiguous. And null, and then null. So you were looking up something, Emo. Do you have an answer?
So basically, what actually, let me show it to you. At this point, it's probably easier. Oh my god. I guess I'm back to caveman editing as well because my fancy multi-cursor editing doesn't do what I want.
Been there.
Oh yeah, we know. We have seen the drama unfold in slow-mo. All right, so
I mean, isn't this what named parameters is supposed to avoid as well?
It doesn't really. I mean, yes, you could do that too. So instead of the cast, you could just say options : null. That would also work.
No, well, I mean, the options parameter is already defaulted to null.
Well,
so if the scenario here is I only want to pass a cancellation token, so great, call read from JSON async open parens cancellation token : whatever you wanted to pass in, close parens semicolon, you're done.
Right. The problem is that pattern matches two different methods.
No, that wouldn't, right? So
no, it shouldn't.
If you just omit this parameter here, like entirely omit it, then there's only one applicable overload, right? Because there's only one overload now that takes that accepts cancellation token in the second.
Because the serializer context version isn't.
Right. It's not defaulted.
It's defaulted.
So it wouldn't be a candidate. I mean, I need to test this. I don't know if I can test it on
Sharpline. This one is basically pointless, right? Because this one would basically just do exactly what this would have done if you just omitted the parameter. So the thing that the customer complains about, that is you passing in null for the second argument, we legitimately can't fix. I mean, unless we introduce a new thing that is taking object, I guess, but even that probably wouldn't bind, right? It would still be saying options is applicable.
Yeah, but any of the three. What I'm saying is, like, if this problem can already be worked around very elegantly.
Well, I think there's no workaround, right? Basically, the proposal for the API the person has, he can already call the APIs with exactly that syntax. So it's not a workaround. It's like it already works. Just don't pass in null. Just pass in nothing. Just say.
Does that work in all languages? Does F# have named parameters and skipping over the optionals, and does it fill the same way?
That I don't know.
You'd have to ask someone.
But I mean,
on that.
the sample code the person provided was all written in C#, so I would assume that's not the case.
Right, because, I mean, yes, we could certainly tell them, remove where you had the literal null and use the named syntax to jump over the ambiguous parameter. Or declare a null const that is typed somewhere.
F# has named arguments, but it I don't remember if you can specify one named argument, skip another named argument, and then continue the list. It does definitely have named arguments and lets you do those named arguments in any order you want, though.
Yeah, so in this case, you wouldn't need to skip over anything. The scenario is that you're passing only the very last argument. Well, I guess the one that takes a type explicitly, you're passing the first and third argument, skipping the second.
Yeah. Right. So you'd be named invoking a defaulted parameter and then implicitly default filling the other one, because nothing would have matched an instance method that took just a cancellation token or an extension method that took just a cancellation token, but it can find one that took a cancellation token and another thing that had a default. So, yeah, as well, they'd have to say cancellation token : cancellation token.
Right.
It won't polyfill to figure out which parameter it could have bound to.
Oh, I get it now. Yes, you are correct.
Yeah, so you have to write the literal letters, cancellation token : somewhere in the call site in order to.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't kill us to add the overload. Having overloads that pass null for a parameter is a thing, but we're certainly not blocking a scenario or making it extremely unduly difficult.
I mean, it's just really ugly now, right? That, I would agree, is a workaround.
But, yeah, I mean, we can certainly but I think if we're going to do it, we should do it for all of the affected method groups on the type. That if we're going to add an overload that doesn't take the options or context, that we just do that everywhere. So you get content cancellation token and content type cancellation token, and those just pick one of the two overloads and call into it as they would previously.
I mean, I would assume that passing in cancellation tokens is kind of common probably for these APIs. The other ones is probably not that common,
right? Meaning you think read from JSON async is the only one people are canceling, and the other extension methods there people probably aren't?
No, I'm saying, like, I think your argument holds. I'm just saying that I think it's probably worthwhile adding that method overload, because people are in an async context. They probably have a cancellation token in scope somewhere, which now means both Rosin and ReSharper are basically telling them, hey, please pass this cancellation token to the API you're calling, because there's an overload that takes one. And if everybody has to write code that looks like, hold on, I have to dig it out again here. Then, this looks a bit like we don't know what we're doing, right? Because now everybody has to type cancellation token : cancellation token. And worst case is probably both Rosin and ReSharper probably just calling the method without the colon, which now immediately gives you squiggles, right? Because they don't know how to pick the one either, probably. They just see there's one that you can't take.
Well,
so in that sense, I think it's.
Yeah, I don't know how they would fill it, because it would depend on the logic that the analyzer did. Because if you called read as JSON async open paren close paren, you are binding to the method that you listed here, and it's saying, hey, you have a cancellation token, you can pass it. Presumably, someone in the fixer ran into an extra optional parameter at some point that they had to skip and said, oh, I need to label this. So I think the fixer would actually do the right thing here. At least if it doesn't, that's just a bug in the fixer.
I mean, it's not that easy to do that though, but yes, I guess.
Well, it is. You know exactly which method you're already binding to, and that it had a cancellation token property that you didn't call, or that you didn't provide a value to. And so then it just needs to invoke it with name syntax.
I see.
Because it doesn't need to pick between the two methods. You're calling this one. You're just getting the implicit default.
Yes.
But, oh, and that's why we can't add the other one. We'd have to add it with a non-default cancellation token. Otherwise, it becomes ambiguous with this method when you don't pass a cancellation token.
Yes.
Which, again, we could do, but I don't know that.
I mean, that would be fine, right? Just being overload.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I'm not opposed to the overload. It certainly can't have a default cancellation token. Which is a little weird, but that's default methods or default parameters for you.
Oh, great. Not quite what I want. All right. I thought that's already the behavior of toImmutable, is it not? Oh, I can't find it now because source.net is broken.
So this is a Fred. I know Fred often wants to be here for his own proposals, but toImmutable is effectively always the latter one. It always clears because it has to or no, sorry. So toImmutable ends up taking the existing array and allocating a new one, copying the data over, and then it leaves the existing immutable array builder as is, whereas move has to clear the underlying array or has to null out the existing array because it copies from it takes the exact array being used by the builder and gives it to the new immutable array instance that gets created. And so this is doing something different that's not there today.
Oh, you're basically saying that what's missing is toImmutable would do what you want, but it would not call clear in case it didn't match the capacity, right?
Right.
Because I believe toImmutable, if capacity is count, does move toImmutable.
No. Move toImmutable is a new API we added in like .NET 6.
Right. So presumably the builder is you add 3 items, you call toImmutable, and then you can add 2 items, and when you call toImmutable the second time, you now have 5 items in the second one.
Oh, that's right. Because the problem is move toImmutable basically takes the data out of the builder. It does not create it does not leave the builder behind versus. Yeah, never mind. I get it now. Yeah, I mean, it's reasonable, I think. Yeah, unless someone has an objection to this, I think we can just approve it as is.
Why wouldn't this be an overload of move to immutable? Because it is effectively move to immutable, correct? Just with a small little behavioral quirk.
Well, it's not a guaranteed move. It's a move if capacity is the same. Otherwise, copy.
Yeah, and copy and clear, basically. Move if you can, and if you can't, copy and clear.
Okay.
So what does move do that's different than copy and clear?
Move takes
guarantees no GC activity?
Right. It takes the exact array that's current and creates an immutable array around that exact array that the builder was using, and then nulls and then sets the builder array to empty.
Yeah. So the fundamental problem is if you have an array already, if you have a, let's say a T array, you can't create an immutable array without copying. Because we don't want somebody else to have access to the array. So the only way you can do it is by basically creating a builder that has the right size, filling that guy up, and then basically saying move to immutable because you never saw the array, right? The builder now transfers the underlying array to the immutable array that just wraps it as is. And so this way we can guarantee that the array is truly immutable.
It also means that move has additional semantics like if the capacity is 8 and you only have 4 items, you're going to get I think you get the 4 extra items still in the immutable array that's created.
Right.
But source.net is down right now for
yes
BCL sources, so it's hard to check.
Well, you can always check on GitHub.
So the intent of this is to reuse the builder, correct?
Well, the intent is more like do a move if you can. If you can't,
Yeah.
do a copy, but then don't leave data behind in the builder, so that the builder is always in the same state afterwards.
Presumably, right? Because you want to reuse the builder. Otherwise, why would you care about it?
Yeah, because in the API usage sample they have there, like that's move if you can and to immutable if you can't, and I don't actually care about the clear because I'm like the GC is about to eat everything.
Yeah, so what he probably omitted here is, but I know that Roslyn does it. Roslyn pools everything, so Roslyn pools builders. So I think the actual Roslyn code sample would be more like you get the pool, right, and then you return it to the pool. And so at that point, you want the builder to be in the same state in both cases, right? You want basically a clean builder to work with the next time you get it.
Well, I guess the next question that I'm coming up with is like, if this is meant to be a very high performance thing, like, should there actually be an API that somehow that doesn't actually copy the underlying array, that simply forwards the underlying array into the immutable array object, but only gives you a segment of it to avoid the copy, even if the capacity is not correct?
That was the thing we discussed to death like 5 years ago when we built immutable array, and the consensus was no, because then people can accidentally observe things that are not meant to be observed, right? So
you can't accidentally do it, you can intentionally do it.
Well, intentionally as in like somebody violates the contract and then bad things happen, right?
Yeah, but you violated the contract.
Right, but basically the idea here is we make it impossible for you to violate the contract, right? So the idea is if you get a mutable array, like you know for sure nobody can mutate it unless somebody did unsafe code. That was the argument back then. So today you would have to write unsafe code in order to mutate the underlying array. There's no way you can write safe code that does it.
I think we should reconsider that if we're willing to reopen that argument.
I mean, we could.
Memory Marshal, we've already said is an unsafe equivalent, and we now have proposals to mark it so that the caller literally has to write the word unsafe.
I mean, it's a question of what's immutable array's implementation. If it assumes that it owns the whole bounded array, then you would now need to you would need to change its size by telling it where the array stopped.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, what's wrong with the proposed API? Because the proposed API maintains.
I guess what I'm getting at is I'm not confident that the API. Go ahead, Emo.
Sorry, I was just saying, like, the proposal here is basically to maintain the guarantee that we currently have, which is nobody can ever get to the underlying array. And it just makes it somewhat easier to work with that pattern.
Right. The thing that I'm really held up on here, though, is that there's a call to clear inside the sample, inside the API proposal, which makes me think that there's some greater scenario that we're failing to cover.
I mean, this is move your, like, I'm done building you, and I want you to make the array and reset. Because I want to use the builder again, and I want to start from a clean state, not from the inherited state.
Yeah.
And then as an implementation detail, which is really all that we would look at it as, in the case where capacity is count, it does that without allocating and copying a new array.
Exactly.
Well, so do we reset the capacity down to 0 as part of this API?
Yeah, so move to immutable basically does that today, right? When you say move to immutable, we basically transfer the array into the newly created immutable array without copies, and then the builder basically becomes equivalent to basically being 0, and that now means that if you call add on it, you basically have an empty builder to work with again.
So
right,
it'd be weird if one operation makes it capacity goes to 0 and the other capacity stays the way it was. I think that would be a very weird behavior.
What I'm concerned about, though, is if we have a situation where I'm always adding the same number of elements to the array, I'm always adding 7 elements to the array just for whatever reason, which means that the array keeps resizing itself up to capacity 8 and then going back down to capacity 0. Like using this pattern, we end up making more allocations than had we just called to immutable and then overwritten the existing elements and then called to immutable again over and over and over. Like, we've actually ended up creating an API that has worse performance than the API today.
Sorry, I'm not entirely sure I follow. What do you mean by we would reallocate if you always add the 7 elements to the array?
So you don't know that you're adding 7 elements, but the particular, you don't know ahead of time that you're adding 7 elements, so you don't know that you need to instantiate the builder with capacity 7. But right. if you're pooling this, I think it's safe to say that you're probably operating on similar looking data over and over and over again. If that's the case, then it's reasonable to expect that we might be adding the same number of elements every single time we call move to immutable or to immutable or whatever. In that case, if we end up in a degenerate case where over and over and over again, the count and the capacity don't match, then what's going to happen is when we call to immutable and clear, what will happen is we'll end up making a copy of the array. We have to because capacity and count don't match. We end up going back to 0, dynamically growing the array again as a power of 2 based on as elements are added. And then when you call to immutable and clear again, the whole process repeats. Whereas it would have been more efficient from the very beginning just to call to immutable, leave all of the existing elements in the array, and then just overwrite them instead of dynamically grow the array.
No, but that's not what would
you
happen.
You end up having fewer copies in the end.
I think
but clear doesn't set the array to null.
Yes.
It just zeroes out the array and keeps the existing capacity.
Exactly.
It's move which sets the array back to empty, and which would then resize up again, and where you'd want to presize the capacity if you know that it's going to be bigger.
Right.
Okay, so this is not going to just throw out the array over and over and over again.
No, well, unless capacity equals count, in which case it will.
Yeah, but in which case, like, you were making a copy anyway, so
exactly.
Well, no, because that's if move doesn't remember capacity. Basically, if capacity goes to 0 after you call move, then this becomes, in my mind, weird.
Why would it be weird?
Because it means that sometimes you're getting the copy and the capacity is preserved. So if we're doing doubling and we start with 2, let's say you're going 500 items, and you build up to 512 every time, then every time you call move, you end up going back through regrowth of you. It's like, yeah, I said builder capacity equal 512. I add a bunch of things. I call to immutable and clear. I add a bunch of things. I call to immutable and clear, but then that second one went through 7, 8 regrowths. But I already set capacity. So why did capacity go back to 0 just because I happened to be equal to my target capacity when I called to immutable and clear, which doesn't say that it was going to reset my capacity.
So it might be good to just tag Fred to come in next Tuesday so Fred can answer these. But based on the example here, what Levi started discussing and what's being discussed now is separate from the scenario which Fred has proposed here in his example usage, which is specifically, let me just get an immutable array out of a builder as efficiently as possible.
Right, and if you're reusing it.
Right, if you get into the reusing scenario, then you get in the scenario of if you're doing a move, the capacity may become 0 and you may want to reset capacity.
Right, but if you just want it as efficiently as possible, you wouldn't want it to clear. You would just call it like move if possible, and then that would clear just so the two moves behave the same. So I guess you would want as so that both the move and the non-move ended up saying there are now 0 items in this builder, but then move if possible would. And I guess it doesn't. You don't care what it does to the array in that case. You just care that count goes to 0.
Yeah, I guess my big concern here is that we're going to have to create some type of opinion here, and that whatever opinion we create is going to end up helping certain use cases and harming certain use cases. I don't see any world in which our opinion that we have to choose is universally correct for all callers. And maybe that's a doc thing, but it's definitely something that I think requires more thought before we just approve it.
What I don't quite understand is like these APIs already exist, right? We have to immutable and move to immutable. So what like the proposed wrapper here, what does it change?
So the problem is, to me, if you call move, capacity goes to 0. And if you call to immutable and clear, count goes to, so move, both count and capacity go to 0. But the other path of this method, where you call to immutable and clear, capacity stays the same, only count goes to 0. And depending on the size of the things that you're building, this means that where you thought you were building a pre-allocated buffer and doing reasonable things as the implementation detail of being more efficient, we have now forced you to go back through array regrowth, which is what you were trying to avoid in the first place. So by adding this quote unquote more efficient thing, we're actually making your code less efficient.
Yeah, we would be adding an API, like Jeremy said, we would be adding an API that we would encourage people to use, but the API has behavioral implications that may or may not be appropriate for your scenario.
And if basically if what we had in the sample code here was if capacity is equal to count, remember what the capacity is, move to immutable, now set the array to new array of capacity, then they would be the same code path.
I mean, but at that point, it's literally to immutable with clear.
It moved the array instead of copying it, which creating an empty array I think is cheaper than cloning an array.
Okay, fair, yes.
So
that is
it would have a mild perf gain if you were exactly right. I mean, but it would have said that when you built it with a capacity in mind, that we keep honoring that capacity.
Yes.
Instead of resetting back down to 0 and then growing from whatever 0 grows to.
Right. So you're saying to immutable and clear should have the same behavior in both paths, and since clear has the behavior of preserving capacity, it would, for the move path, have to, instead of setting to an empty array, set it to a capacity array, and an API which did to immutable and effectively reinit for with whatever name we came up with would be something which would set to empty array on both paths if we had such an API.
Right, and like we could say if move to immutable is throwing right now when it has to make a copy, we could just get rid of that behavior. And move to immutable could become move it if you can, copy it if you can't, and always set the inner array to null. Because somebody can test externally is capacity count. Like, if we're throwing when we don't need to.
Fred started this proposal with stating that this is a method that he's found he had to define in all the projects it uses, so likely Roslyn and any personal projects, because they want the behavior of do the efficient thing when the capacity's been exactly filled and do the other thing otherwise.
Right, but if move throws when it can't, we could, if all that he wants is be as efficient as you could be, we could make move be what he thinks this is, except it would have the behavior, because it's move, capacity always goes to 0 after you call it.
Right, but I don't think move throws at all. Oh no, it does. It throws when count doesn't equal capacity.
Right. Yeah. And we could change move to immutable to be do what it's doing if they equal, and copy and null out your own array if they aren't, and ta-da. Like,
but doesn't that, so move implies free, I think, which is why they went with that name. And if you suddenly have it start allocating, then it's no longer a move.
Okay, I mean, again, yeah, so if what we want is move to immutable if possible, which then becomes the safer method to call because it does exactly the fallback you would want, then that's fine. But it's whatever method we're adding, it should have the same behavior on capacity in both the case where it aligned and where it didn't. And I don't like that this one, that there's implementation detail that can matter to your call context. Apparently Fred doesn't care about that implementation detail, which means he must not be regrowing. But it sounds like what he wants is to just say we should get rid of the throw out of move to immutable, because you either want to move efficiently if you can, or do the minimum amount of work if you can't, and move could do that instead of throwing.
Yeah, I mean, we could also like consider just changing the behavior of move to not reset the capacity, right?
The only way that it could do that is by move already says new array of the capacity size, at which point now you're just back down to this minimal difference between it's cheaper to create a new array than to clone one.
Sorry, I think you lost me. So why would it have to allocate the array immediately?
Well, what move, I assume the idea behind move is I've built the builder, I'm not going to reuse it, don't duplicate the array, just transfer it into the immutable array. And then you're done with the builder, and then nothing ever mattered again.
Well, so the way move works today, right? Once you called move, basically the builder is the same as if the builder would have been initialized with create builder of 0.
Yes.
Right, so the builder is still usable. You can still add to it. You just get the behavior if you would have passed in 0, right? So there's really nothing preventing us from saying, you can make the allocation lazy, right? You could just set the array to null, which I think is happening anyway. I think it is lazy. Because the idea is most of the time you are done with the builder, but if the off chance you are not, we're not allocating just in case. So we would do it lazily, but nothing really prevents us from leaving capacity and whatever the value currently is. And it just means when you reallocate the array, you just use that as the capacity, right?
So right now, capacity is only determined by how long the array is. It doesn't remember the value you passed in the constructor. It just used that for how big to make the array in the first place.
Oh,
so we could change it and we could add a capacity field on the builder and then and make move keep capacity the same. And when it grows from the empty array, it will grow to the capacity array, unless capacity was 0. And the
tracking a new capacity field, which would
'Cause, yeah.
likely make it too expensive.
Yes.
making the builder, instead of being an array and a length is too expensive.
We've shot down adding an extra int field to mini structs where it may be more efficient because of the increased memory overhead.
It's not a struct though, right? The builder is a the builder is a class.
Yeah, the builder's a class.
Right.
So I mean, on the builder we can probably absorb that, would be my guess. But I mean, it also kind of depends on how pooling works in Roslyn, right? Like I assume when you return things to the pool, because you're effectively getting random capacities anyway, I think they must have some policy of saying, you know, you need to have at least 8 or 10 or 15, whatever the number is, in order to be in the pool. And then
Right, and it could be that Roslyn, when they pull these things out of the pool, they say, you know, if capacity is less than X, go ahead and promote it to X. But yeah, I don't like that toImmutable and clear does things differently than calling toImmutable and clear if capacity was count. As in, there's an observable side effect. Capacity changed if you hit that top if.
Yeah.
If we can preserve that behavior, I'm fine with the method and don't care what its implementation is. But I think that would be, it's either pre-allocating, which probably isn't what Roslyn wants, or it requires storing the extra capacity field. But yeah, my assumption is what they really want is move toImmutable to not throw. Move the array. I'm keeping the builder instance pre-allocated for no particular reason. I guess GC new is expensive. And I will set the capacity before I start working with it again, or I'll deal with the growth. And if that's what Roslyn wants to do in Roslyn, that's fine. And making move toImmutable not throw would also accomplish that. Or we add move toImmutable if possible, which is the method that says don't throw if, like, we know what you want to do if capacity is not able to count, and we'll just do it for you.
I still think maybe we should wait till Tuesday and make sure Fred's here so he can explain the Roslyn scenario.
That's fair.
I mean, we can, but I think like the concern stands on itself, right? Like it's more like the question of like, okay, what would make sense for Roslyn? But I think the concern as it's sketched right now, I don't think we want to ship no matter what, right?
Right. I think the concern is a valid concern of we have an API which differs in behavior on 2 paths, and that will be confusing to some customers if they target the scenario of reuse the builder. And so we would want an API called toImmutable and clear to likely have clear behavior on both paths. No pun intended.
Yeah.
Preserves the capacity.
Consistent.
And there would be a different, yes. And if we wanted an API which had the empty set size back down to empty, then we would likely have a different API, maybe toImmutable and empty or something. We don't have a term for this, but it would have the behavior of, instead of keeping the capacity, it would just set the underlying array to array.empty of t.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's bring this up again then on Tuesday and see where we land. I need to mark it right now for something, otherwise it doesn't show up in the notes, and then we can reflect it back after this. All right, so then I think we're out of time.
Should you go ahead and change it back to API ready for review? That way Fred can
He needs to hit post on the
Right.
Okay.
meeting notes, and then I think he suggested he was going to do so after
Yes.
posting.
Oh,
That was the
okay,
idea.
okay.
So then, all right, then I guess Tuesday it is. All right, friends, that's it for today. Bye bye.